This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you. Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am here today with Sam Hammond, or Samuel Hammond, as he is more formally. He is a senior economist at, what is this new place that you're working at? A Foundation for American Innovation, FAI, which, DC, it's an acronymed place. And before that, you were at Niskanen, and you were also at the Mercatus Center. You have a master's from George Mason, and also an undergrad degree, and I think a master from Carleton in Canada. You are Canadian, for anyone who cares. I don't think that's relevant to any of this stuff. I'm glad you got out of there. You're the U.S. You are in the metropole, in the empire. So Sam,
Canada has a better system of government, but America has 2-day shipping.
Wait, you really think Canada has a better system of government? Are you serious?
Yes, but
I don't.
My home city still doesn't have Uber, so it is worth the trade.
Wait, what's your home city?
Halifax.
Oh yeah, so you're from the Atlantic. You're from the Atlantic provinces that got added in accidentally, right?
No, we were the OGs.
Well, what about Newfoundland?
Newfoundland was added in the 1930s. It was actually called the Balfour Declaration, a different Balfour Declaration.
Yeah. I mean, nobody knows Canadian history, man. We barely realize Canada exists except for Trudeau shenanigans. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. It's funny to share.
Newfoundland was shortlisted for Jewish homeland. Little known fact.
Okay, that is super weird. I think I've heard that somewhere, and I think I've discarded it in the past, and I'll probably discard it again because Canada facts they don't really stick with me. I don't know why. It's just kind of there. It fills up a part of the map, okay, we gotta talk about AI, and not Canada. We gotta talk about the future, not the past. Because Canada is a country of the past in some way. Well, no, it's. With global warming, with anthropogenic climate change, whatever you want to call it, some parts of Canada are not looking that bad.
No.
I mean, there's some opportunity here. Wait, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna ask you this. This is totally not part of the what is up with Canadian housing? Do you guys have the same NIMBY stuff that we have?
Yeah, in a bigger way. So there's multiple things. So the first thing is we have all the same NIMBYism. That's a broader Anglo sphere phenomena, I think, originating from our property law and common law. Then the other factor in Canada is we have much less sprawl. So where there's problems in the U.S. in terms of density, we have those problems, but then we also don't have the sprawl that a lot of U.S. cities have. And then the third and final factor is really twofold. One, our high rate of immigration in recent years, and two, all the Chinese money. So it's a store of wealth in China, and people are getting their money out of China. They buy up real estate in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, just to explicate what you're talking about here, Chinese, I think it started with Hong Kong Chinese, but I think it's just Chinese in general now. They buy assets abroad. One of those assets they buy abroad is Canadian housing, houses starting in Vancouver, but I'm assuming in Toronto and elsewhere now too. And those houses are a store of wealth. And during the Bloomberg regime, I know that in New York, a lot of people would complain that the Russian oligarchs were doing that with New York apartments. So they would buy these apartments, nobody would live in them. And so the frustrating thing is, apartments, houses, ideally people live in them. They're not just some sort of financial instrument to store your wealth. So that's what angers people. And then I alluded to the NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. And it's basically just really difficult to build in some parts of the Anglosphere. It seems to be a disproportionately Anglosphere problem. Britain is, I need to do a podcast with someone who's British, because I know the Japanese have a tradition of suicide due to dishonor, but something happened, and the UK has agreed to commit economic suicide over the last 10 years. I don't think it's great. I don't laugh at it. It's just kind of sad, but I literally do shake my head every week reading about the weird things that they do in the UK or say, or so for example, they have a housing crisis. They're like, well, actually, some academics and people in the government are saying, well, you know what? A lot of people just have too many rooms. It's really a problem of misallocation of rooms. Like, what are you trying to say? Like, the Ministry of Housing is going to resettle people into baby boomers' houses,
Right.
And so, I think Sam and I both think that straightforward market-based solution, which is build houses,
legalize it. So what's going on in Vancouver now is the Squamish Reserve, First Nations Reserve, has sovereignty over their land, and they're now upzoning it. And all the white NIMBYs in Vancouver are complaining that it doesn't hew to their traditional ways. But I say a skyscraper is a longhouse. It's just put on its end.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the neoliberal future. This is the neoliberal future they took from us. We have the engineering. Asian cities have the engineering. Now, I think, I'm trying to get some housing people on this podcast, actually, because I think housing is important for fertility in the future and whatever. It's kind of stupid in a way because I think we know how to do it. But, people complain, oh, well, we don't want these Asian skyscrapers and everything like that. But here in the U.S., we have a lot of space. You can have exurbs. You can have skyscrapers.
Oh, yeah.
You can do all sorts of things. There's no trade-off here.
No. And as we segue into talking about AI, like if AI revolutionizes the economy, the thing that will be scarce is still land.
Yeah. And so we'll still have these fights. So okay, AI. So I saw this. So I know you, Sam, from just around. We met in DC before, so same. We move in the same circles. And I saw this cleverly titled piece, 95 theses on AI. It's at your Substack, second best. It's kind of like you post pretty infrequently, but when you post, people start to take notice. 95 Theses obviously is an allusion to Martin Luther with his 95 Theses, right? The Reformation, which destroyed medieval Western civilization, destroyed, some people would say, the unity of Christendom, created the modern world, unleashed, diabolical degeneracy. Whatever you believe,
a mixed bag, in other words.
Yeah, whatever you believe about the positives or negatives, some shit went down in the early 16th century, and Martin Luther's 95 Theses are an anchor, right? And so, in a way, that should be pointing to people that you think this is a big deal. You think AI in our time is a really big deal.
Yes, absolutely. I have a line in there saying the open question is whether AI is like the printing press or photosynthesis. Right, and your doomerism will vary based on that.
Well, I mean that's incredible though, because the printing press is a big deal. The floor, like you set the floor very high, like you set the floor at the sky, and you set the ceiling in space or something. I don't know how to explain it because photosynthesis. Yeah, so just to allude, or just to dig down what you're trying to say there. The printing press transformed human culture over the last, over 5 centuries. There is evidence, Patrick Wyman has talked about this, but there is evidence in economic history papers that where there was a higher density of printing presses, the Protestant Reformation was much more likely to break out and succeed in German cities. So the printing press is a precondition for religious and cultural change. I think we know that. I think the internet is kind of an accelerated version of that. Photosynthesis was an energy revolution, transforming, basically increasing the ability of life to extract energy, so much more. Like we shift from anaerobic to aerobic and whatnot. Coupled with oxidation or oxygen respiration, we are able to transform energy from the sun into energy that powers us, right? And so this is a pretty big claim. There are people who think this is just another hype cycle. And what do you say to them?
We've come out of 40 years of relative stagnation, right? The whole great stagnation discourse. And I think, even older generations haven't really lived through periods of rapid technological change. And so you have to reach back into history. And a lot of the innovation we've had over the last 40 years and a lot of innovation boosters have been boosting a kind of like pseudo Potemkin kind of innovation. So we really haven't experienced that. Maybe our great grandparents did, and my grandparents are deceased. Maybe they saw, my grandfather on my mother's side, his house was the first on his street to get electricity, right? So that's a big deal. But really, since then, we've been in this kind of relative plateau. We get modest improvements, better mousetraps, some information technology that hasn't shown up in the GDP statistics. Maybe this is sort of think of the internet era as the kind of bootloader to the AI era, right? The kind of 40 years of tinkering and complementary investments that don't show up in GDP until they do. But people just haven't. People are used to this being the normal, and don't understand how weird actually the world is today relative to 200 years ago, and how unnatural and out of equilibrium it is.
Yeah, so I mean, you're alluding to like a lot of things here. So basically, the internet, it seems like there was some productivity increase from the internet, but not as much as people thought, or at least maybe the statistics are not being, and you could correct me here, you're an economist. The statistics are not corrected or collected appropriately, or it's not factored in terms of productivity gain. But you're saying here AI, like if the internet is a bootloader, so AI is it's the main show, right?
Yeah.
Of this period. And so what did you think like a couple of years, like when did this like come into your mind? Like, was it ChatGPT? Was it earlier?
No, it's one of the big reasons I moved to the US. I went to George Mason at the Mercatus Center, which was sort of this strange ecosystem of like Austrian libertarians and cyber libertarian rationalists like Robin Hanson and folks like that. So I've always been interested in that kind of, they used to call themselves the extropians, the kind of less wrong, overcoming bias community. So that, I think probably my entry point was picking up Age of Spiritual Machines, the Ray Kurzweil book, when I was in middle school and reading that. And he had basically his extrapolations of Moore's law and other trends out to 2040, and his marker for when we'd have human level AI was around 2029, which is actually now where the current forecasts are converging.
Yeah, so maybe I'm not keeping track of it, but Ray's been surprisingly quiet from what I can tell right now. I feel like he was everywhere between 2000 and 2010, and he's just kind of not said much from what I can tell.
He's still doing stuff. He just did the Rogan podcast, and he has a new book coming out called "The Singularity is Even Nearer." So he's about to do a press tour around that. He's taking like 80 pills a day to try to live longer.
He's been doing that for a while now.
Yeah, does not seem to be working.
No, I'm not gonna make any comment on someone's mortality in their expected years, right? So your first, so you have like, okay, these are like arrayed in sequence. You have 95 of these assertions, but they're bracketed into these kind of like categories or like these classes. So your first one is oversight of AI labs is prudent. I don't really know anything about. I mean, is there any oversight right now? Is the oversight Sam Altman's conscience?
Pretty much. I mean, there's some voluntary stuff. So there's this Frontier AI forum where basically Google, Anthropic, Microsoft, and OpenAI, have made a set of voluntary commitments. But there's at this point, no formal insight into the labs other than the White House executive order last year, which created these compute thresholds that said, if you train a model above these thresholds, 10 to the 25 flops, which for reference, GPT-4 is about 10 to the 24 flop scale model. So nothing that we've seen to date has really crossed that threshold. But when they do, in principle, they're supposed to disclose their safety testing and so forth to the Department of Commerce.
Well,
I argue that is good and smart and reasonable and should be differentiated from like AI regulation or something more comprehensive.
Well, so just contemporary relevance right now, which I try to avoid on this podcast, but as we're recording, a bunch of people have exited. Ilya and the other people within OpenAI that take existential risk seriously, right? So it doesn't seem that OpenAI is actually. There's a lot of complaints from people that were there earlier or supported OpenAI earlier back when Elon was involved. That Greg Brockman and Sam Altman are being irresponsible, and they're basically just they don't care about the existential risk part at all. They think it was either crazy or dumb, and so there's a lot of you know there's a lot of noise about that right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is like in contrast to I think I mentioned this on the podcast before. I asked why Google had not done this AI revolution, because OpenAI with ChatGPT transformed everything. Well, why didn't Google do it? Somebody at DeepMind, an engineer, and I know several engineers at DeepMind, and who've worked on Gemini and whatever, they said that at Google, they were too worried about existential risk type stuff, or they were too worried about the consequences. And so what happened was there was a demotivation on the part of the researchers to ever do anything because nothing ever progressed. They never approved anything because people were too afraid.
There might be something to that, but I also think Google is just a bloated company, and they had their old X Labs, for instance, where they were like building blimps that shoot down internet and stuff like that, and a lot of those things just died in the vine because they were basically R&D research efforts that had no sort of productization intent, and those teams would just were doing their thing off on their own. I imagine it's the same thing with AI, although DeepMind was spun out and has since been brought back into Google.
Yeah. So in terms of regulation, I think everyone assumes that there's going to be regulation. There's going to be oversight. AI is too big of a technology. For example, the genetic space where I come from, there was a Asilomar conference in the 70s about recombinant technology. And there's all sorts of self-regulation and explicit regulation related to genetic engineering technology and whatnot, right? So I think AI, that's going to happen. My question, though, is and this is the issue that actually privately there's a lot of conversations about this. What if the U.S. has these strict regulations and I don't know, China does not? How do we work AI into a context of great power competition?
Yeah, and I'm very concerned about that as well. I have a new piece in American Affairs talking about geopolitics of AI and compute. And that's why I think that actual, statutory regulation of AI per se is either ill-conceived or premature. There's, on the ill-conceived side, there are even within the federal government, sort of the kind of, federal government regulating itself through guidance and so forth. Very messy, confused guidance around, rules for reducing harm when you're using AI, where AI basically means software, and how you draw a line to sort of carve nature at its joints to distinguish between, basic machine learning and statistics versus agential, intelligent reasoning models is actually harder than it sounds, because you can sort of tell the difference. But to draw the line into the law is hard because by nature, more is different, right? There are qualitative difference from quantity when you scale these models up. And that's why I think, I want to segment the litany of potential AI regulatory issues from the core concern I have around the hyperscalers. And those are basically OpenAI, Anthropic, and their patrons in the form of Microsoft and Google.
Yeah, I mean, here in the States, we just had an issue about whether burritos were sandwiches. So, these regulations, how they're interpreted, how they're written, they can get really weird in terms of what gets classified as what. So just because you write something that you think is straightforward, it might not have the impact that you think. So you have your second class is most of the AI regulations are ill-conceived or premature, and I'm assuming that you're talking here about these like top-down, kind of like clunky regulations. Can you talk about some of the things that have been proposed?
Yeah, I've been critical of the EU AI Act. Of a piece in City Journal discussing its problems. It does this. It sort of tries to combine two things. So originally it was this risk tier framework. And by the way, the EU AI Act was developed beginning 4 years ago. So it predates ChatGPT and reflects a kind of 2010s view of AI, where it's all about algorithmic bias and harmed from discrimination, and so forth. So it lays out these 4 risk tiers from like minimal to no risk to high risk, where high risk means you could be denied a loan. You know, it could recognize your emotions, or like these things that are dubious to call high risk. It also lumps in critical infrastructure, medical devices, which you could make an argument. But a lot of the things that they consider high risk are not high risk at all. They're about protecting the European 4 freedoms or whatever. And so that's bad in and of itself. But secondly, it's bad because it's done at a use level. So it's not that they're going to the few big companies that are creating these foundation models and saying, you must make sure your models are not going to take over the world. They're saying anyone who uses these systems in a particular application or use case has to abide by these rules, has to have quality assurance systems in place and monitoring systems in place. It's a train wreck in terms of its scope. And that's the kind of thing I worry about coming to the US. That sort of thing really would stifle innovation in the US. And you're already seeing it in the case of Europe, where a lot of US companies are delaying the release or planning to not release there at all.
Yeah, I mean, so we've seen this with the Europeans before, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but it seems like the EU in particular has been thinking that it can kind of veto or kind of affect the corporate technological just framework that the whole world has, because it's a big economy and they can act it with one voice. I think that that's getting less and less impactful though, because it seems to me that a lot of these cutting edge technologies are almost writing Europe off. I don't know what you think. I don't keep track of it closely, but that's my perception.
Yeah, no, going back to the conversation about the internet, seeing internet and GDP statistics. Robert Gordon has a great paper on the transatlantic productivity slowdown, where he shows that yes, productivity has been slowing down across the West, but there was a legitimate IT boom that boosted US GDP in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it didn't manifest in Europe. So Europe already missed out on one productivity wave, and now they're about to miss out on the next.
Yeah, like so there's there's massive this might be part of we have all these unicorns, like this might be part of the reason for the GDP gap that's like growing between, it looks like, the EU and the UK and the US, right? So
they're also very like even with the common market and Eurozone, the economies are much more fragmented. Like there's obviously huge differences between Italy and France and Germany versus Nevada, Utah, and Idaho.
Yeah, that's true. It's different economic. So okay, so these top down regulations will not work, and so obviously what you're talking about is like focusing on every use case, like focusing on consumers, like that's kind of micromanaging, right? Yeah. Like we need to look at the companies, the big players that are scaling, because there are lots of, like, actually every single startup that's in tech right now is an AI startup, at least according to the people that they're trying to raise seed money for. So there's AI and then there's AI.
Exactly.
And so what you're talking about is like these big players are really the ones that are on the forefront and pushing things forward. And I think the reason is they're the ones that are training these really, really powerful models, because like these models are extremely compute intensive. They're expensive, right?
Exactly. And in every case, whether it's DeepMind, OpenAI, or Anthropic, have building AGI as their explicit mission.
Yeah. Okay. And you can only do that with a massive amount of compute horsepower.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it's obvious you can't ignore what they're doing. And in terms of just oversight, it's quite different than like tracking every single business that's in this space.
Yeah, exactly. And the way we're doing it now, at least provisionally, is with this executive order that uses the Defense Production Act, which is just it's a misunderstood part of the law, but it's essentially the powers of the Department of Defense to have oversight and intervene if they need to, right? And it's a discretionary thing, and people don't like discretion often. People prefer rules. But one of the issues when you have fast changing technology and events is discretion really matters. And when it and their focus, their mandate is to focus solely on things that implicate national security, whether that's that includes both like a super intelligence or dual use technologies like for cyber warfare or biological engineering.
Well, okay, so one of your assertions, or just like a class of bundle theses, let's just put it that way, is the AI progress is accelerating and not plateauing. Can you talk about why you think that? Because other people have been saying that it's plateauing. Some people, so as we're recording, ChatGPT 4.0 or 4.0 came out, and some people are saying, oh, it's not really that much of an advancement, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that GPT-4 was trained in 2022. So OpenAI has had a 2-year lead. They've explicitly said that they're slow rolling the release of these things to encourage sort of societal adaptation and so forth. GPT 4.0 is a GPT-4 scale model, so it's intentionally trying not to push the frontier out. And nonetheless, on the subjective leaderboards where they have, they give you 2 model outputs and you don't know which is which, and you vote on which one you prefer. It's almost 100 ELO points above the next best model. So it is significantly better, especially at coding. And they attributed that to its post-training. So my speculation is that it's been post-trained on GPT-5 outputs.
Okay, wait, can you explain what that is?
So when you train one of these large language models or large multimodal models, or you train it in several steps. Step 1 is called the pre-training phase, where that you're just purely trying to predict the next token, whether it's all the text on the internet, all the videos on YouTube, you're trying to predict the next frame, the next word. And then you're left with a text completion engine where you type some words and it continues your words. The next stage is called instruction tuning and supervised fine tuning, where that's when you turn the thing into a chatbot where it actually answers in full paragraphs and so on. And then the final stage is reinforcement learning from human feedback. That's where you imbue it with the ethics or whatever. But you can also use that stage to fine tune its outputs with a more powerful model. So even as a GPT-4 scale model, they could use GPT-5, which people think has already been trained, and have GPT-5 be the source of feedback to tighten up the model and make it smarter without scaling it.
Okay, that makes sense. So I will say that I pay for Gemini, Claude, and GPT, OpenAI, ChatGPT. Definitely 4.0 is Claude. I had started to use Claude more than ChatGPT 4, and then now that 4.0 came out, I went back to Chat. Yeah. You know what this feels like? This feels like the browser wars of the 1990s, and like you youth don't remember, but there was a new browser that was coming out every couple of months, and so Netscape would come out with a browser, then Microsoft would come out with another browser a month later, and so you get like 3 new upgrades within a year or within like 6 months. Just crazy. And then like eventually Microsoft won the browser war, and we just got the same Explorer for like about 10 years until Firefox and Explorer and Chrome changed things, right? So we are in that like
free.
What was free?
The browsers. I'm paying. With these models, I don't want to look at my bank account, my checking account, because it's just subscriptions up the wazoo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's expensive. So that's one of the, so you're talking about AI progress is accelerating. People are freaking out about that. But one of the limitations is just, energy inputs, right? It's just like cost.
Yeah. All the inputs. So the hardware inputs is one the main thing that's just started to alleviate, right? So, people who are saying, the Gary Marcuses of the world, one of the preeminent AI skeptics, is like, well, where is, if scaling is really paying off, where is the new, better model? We haven't had a new, better model in a while. And I just said that, GPT-4 is really 2.5-year-old technology at this point. To release a model, you also have to have the infrastructure to train it, and then you have to have the infrastructure to service it for inference, especially if you want to make it free and have millions of users. And last year, NVIDIA produced 500,000 H100s. They were completely sold out. Everyone was trying to buy them. This year, they've quadrupled their production. And there were some key shortages with packaging and some other components to go into these GPUs that is just now starting to alleviate. And that's why you've started to see, not just progress start to pick back up at the leading companies, but also many other players get into the game because finally the chips are available.
Okay, so there was a rate limitation on the hardware.
Yeah.
And then after the hardware, there's the issue where it's like, a substantial proportion of the world's, energy is now going into various types of cloud computing, right? At some point, AI is going to be, AI is already a non-trivial, like it's not like a huge amount, but it's detectable, right? These companies are burning through so much energy. Like I heard that Microsoft is having to kind of like rebalance its just in terms of how much electricity its various computers are using because it's focusing so much on AI.
Yeah, no, I think I remember reading somewhere that this most recent disclosure from Microsoft had their like their energy utilization jump like 20 something percent, presumably from these data centers. And so that's also why these companies, the hyperscalers, are starting to vertically integrate power generation, right? So Amazon just bought a data center that's attached to a nuclear facility. Microsoft has a whole team of Nuclear Regulatory Commission experts trying to build their own reactors. Power will be the next bottleneck now that we have the chips.
Okay, so I know that this is true, and I've heard other people say this. If we do have AGI, do you ever like wonder if like it wakes up and it's like, you know what? I need more power. These people are using too much power. And like, energy is the reason that they come after us. Have you ever thought about that?
As one of the motivations for like a rogue AI?
Yeah. It's just hungry.
I could see that. Yeah, I could see that. It's hungry. I don't put a ton of stock into like rogue AI exfiltrates the data center and starts killing everybody because of instrumental convergence or whatever. I don't think there's like a zero chance that happens. I worry about just once we have that same super intelligence, and let's say alignment is easy, right? Because maybe intelligence and motivation are orthogonal, right? You can have something very smart, and then the motivations are what you decide. That intelligence could be completely controllable, completely quote unquote aligned, but still be very destabilizing because humans have different and conflicting interests.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a more plausible story than the AI escapes the lab and starts to,
Well, I mean, how would it's not like we have robots, it's, how AI is not in the world. I think that's the biggest thing that until like Boston Dynamics or whatever becomes more than just cool YouTube videos.
Well, that will be changing next year. So companies like Figure, these humanoid robotic companies, that there's several of them that have roadmaps to produce millions of units a year at a cost point of like $10,000 per humanoid robot, and they're beginning to now scale up.
$10,000 is not that expensive.
No, it's not.
Are you trying to say that I can get a robot slave soon?
Very soon, robot slave is coming to you.
Well, but we'd use a different word. Robot helper.
Yeah.
A helper. Your robot friend and helper.
Exactly.
Now, will they have the 3 laws of robotics?
That's
I don't
upgrade.
I don't want the robot to that's a patch. I don't want the robot to have a hallucination and punch me in the face and like poke a hole in my face. That's what I would be worried about. Okay. So you were saying in here, okay, so 6 and 3.6. That's what I want to focus on because I'm a little confused by this. I'm just going to read it. AI may cause a speed up in R&D and quickly go superhuman, but is unlikely to foom into a godlike ASI given compute bottlenecks and the irreducibility of high-dimensional vector spaces, i.e. Kurzweil is underrated. Talk about what you mean there.
So, Kurzweil has long, his predictions spanning back to the 90s at least, said that we'd have human-level AI by 2029, so you call that AGI, but then the singularity would be in 2045. And there's a lot of questions around that. So why would you have this like 16-year gap between AGI and superintelligence? Why wouldn't the advent of AGI lead to us being able to multiply the number of AI researchers and bootstrap a superintelligence within months or a short number of years? And my answer to that is, well, prior to this revolution, to the deep learning revolution, you could have thought that AGI might have been like a simple algorithm, a few lines of code. And that's, you just had to find the right algorithm to do like the right kind of induction or something like that. But it turns out that like what actually works is a trillion parameter neural network. And you need all those parameters to store very high dimensional concepts and world models. And so you can't, there has been advances in distilling these models and getting comparable performance from smaller models. But that's what I mean by the vector space being irreducible. At some point, you can't crunch these models smaller without losing capability. And so
Yeah.
for that reason, you don't just go from AGI to super intelligence. You may go from AGI to a much smarter AGI, but until you build out the compute and have the capacity to store a much bigger model, you can't actually just bootstrap your way to it.
Okay, so this part of the issue here is, obviously, not everyone knows what a vector is and all these things. I think the way I'm going to think about is, or explain it to people, is we had this idea back in the day that you could write an algorithm or you could program the AI, and that's basically in that side of a scenario, you can, as you imply there or just assert, you can apply. There could be like some very simple way to create AI. We just don't know how. But what we're showing here is we need to brute force it, with these neural networks. And so the neural networks have to keep increasing. And then weird stuff happened. Okay. And this is like, I've done some other podcasts about AI, and you go back and you read people in 2017 and they're like, like, how do we know that, it's not, there's no reason that this would like create any sort of like gain in artificial intelligence. And then, OpenAI released its, ChatGPT, and everyone's like, oh, we were totally wrong. Which to me means that, like, on some deep level, they don't understand what's going on. They didn't understand what was going on, right? Whereas these, like, writing an algorithm or writing a program, we would understand, right? And so there's like almost like a natural input, like the energy to scale these neural networks, the hardware to scale these neural networks. They need to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if there's a correlation between that and these super intelligences and how super they are, well, we just don't even have like the raw input resources, right? We're resource limited, is what you're getting to. Whereas if we had like a top-down AI model that they were imagining from like the 1970s, that's not the main consideration. It's ingenuity or our understanding of some deep dynamics about intelligence.
Yeah, that's exactly my view. And it's not just that we're like brute forcing it, is that there might be something inherent to the size that is required, and you can try to shrink it as much as you can, but there's some like minimum size if you want to capture all the relationships and dependencies and so on within the world that we're trying to model.
Well, what do you mean by slow takeoffs eventually become hard?
So, one version of the hard takeoff, the sort of FOOM scenario that Eliezer Yudkowsky popularized, was the kind of, you cross some like threshold of intelligence and things FOOM in the sense that it starts to recursively self-improve and the line goes vertical. And maybe we go from like human level to super intelligence in a matter of, hours or even seconds. And so that's the hard takeoff. The slow takeoff is where things are more gradual. You're still on some kind of exponential curve, but and maybe this is the world we're in today, where we're sort of seeing the bubblings of this like early part of the exponential. And all I mean by slow takeoffs become hard is that even exponentials that have a relatively flat starting point eventually do go vertical, right? Unless something stops them.
Yeah.
And so there's not that huge a distinction between a slow takeoff and a hard takeoff, other than once you're in the vertical part of the range.
Yeah, this is back to Kurzweil's contention, which is true. Humans are really bad at exponential rates of growth, where it's like, well, actually, remember early during the pandemic, in March of 2020, there were people on Twitter, including doctors, that were saying, look, there were 8 people that were sick last week, and like, ooh, now we have like 70 people sick, this week. And they're like, at this rate, and we're just like, no, you idiot. Again, the exponentials, they did not understand exponentials. People have like weak intuition on that.
Totally.
So I guess like another thing I want to ask about is the open source stuff. I'm a little Meta's open source. Obviously, the others are not. What is the issue there? Because isn't the key limiter training the data, which is just mega expensive? So who cares?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, you need a huge amount of compute, huge data centers, lots of GPUs, and you need lots of data and a really talented team of engineers. And there is a broader open source ecosystem, right? And there's open source tools from like Stable Diffusion for images. There's audio versions, there's open source language models, and that's all great. And I think it's all fantastic. I think everything that's been open source to date has been a huge net positive. Even things like AlphaFold, very positive. But yeah, in the discourse, there's this debate raging between, it's the AI safety people are trying to crack down open source and they're going to destroy the open source ecosystem, and open source is a strength and we should be rewarding it. And actually open source models are more secure because they're been battle tested. And I think it's all distraction. Because if you are focused on the AGI specific risks, really those are going to be proprietary models built by companies with huge amounts of compute. It's not an open source project you can do with some friends in your garage, with the one exception being Meta, because Meta has, almost as a public good of sorts, invested. I think they spent over $200 billion amassing their data, their GPUs, and models like Llama 3, their open source language model. The bigger version of that would probably be on the order of $100 million to train, and they're just putting that out for free. And part of that is a business strategy, because they were kind of late to the AI game, and they recognize that if they just put out a free version, they're going to undercut everyone else. But it's also not really the core of what people think of as this open source, closed source philosophical debate. This is just one company that has the resources to open source these large models. And the question is, will they continue open sourcing them even when they get into dangerous territory? And I tend to think that market incentives will keep them from doing that, because Meta shareholders don't benefit if they destroy the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm actually now I'm curious about the section accelerate versus decelerate is a false dichotomy. I haven't thought about detail about this, but I actually kind of agree. Can you just unpack like the EAC, EA, and all these things? And so you say in here, and after the fact, it kind of makes sense. I hadn't thought about it this way. EA is rooted in Christian humanism, and EAC is Nietzschean atheism. Like these sorts of connections you make and how it relates to modern politics. I think that's interesting. And talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, at least on Twitter, the accelerationists and the effective altruists are seen to be as like opposing forces, where the EAs are all these like weird autist doomers who read the Lestron sequences and now think that AI is going to come kill everybody and we need to just like stop technology because technology is bad. Whereas the EACs are like the techno optimists who think technology is mostly good and positive and we should just lean forward. And this, I think, is a total like misnomer of what's actually going on. The EAs and the EACs are both rationalists. They were both part of a community that saw AI coming, a decade ago, had these debates, were worried about it. Then they sort of splinter off, where the EAs are like, this could be really serious. We need to invest ahead of time to get a grapple on this and try to figure out what are technical solutions, interpretability, things like that. The EACs, the true EACs, they're not really techno optimists, right? They're not like Mark Andreessen saying that AI is just going to bring us better healthcare, right? They are trying to build the machine god. Like they believe that we're going to build the sand god out of silicon, so in that respect, they're just like the EAs. They just think that this is going to give them transcendence, and that like we should just drive forward because, at least in the sort of orthodox EAC interpretation, there's a kind of entropic direction to history and to the universe where complex systems are constantly trying to expand and harness new sources of free energy, and this will just be that next stage, right? So this, going back to is this the printing press or photosynthesis? The EACs, the techno optimists are more like somewhere around the printing press, maybe less than that. The EACs are like, no, this is photosynthesis and it's great.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good breakdown. And also one of the things I've been surprised by, kind of been heartened by. I don't think that I don't think AI has been negative polarized yet. I mean,
No,
would
I
you
agree.
agree with me on that?
Yeah, certainly, especially in the broader public. Like, there's been some good polling on this showing that Republicans in particular are actually even more down on AI. They're worried about it in a variety of different contexts. But the masses are not polarized whatsoever. This is more so an elite Twitter thing.
Yeah. So that was interesting to me because it seems like everything gets polarized very fast. Maybe it's because this is a serious thing. Because like a lot of stuff we get polarized by is kind of retarded.
Yeah, but also like look at what the EX are saying. So Rich Sutton, one of the godfathers of reinforcement learning, he wrote a famous essay called "The Bitter Lesson," which is like we tried all these things with AI. The bitter lesson is all that really matters is scale, right? Scale the thing up. And so he's well known name in AI. He recently has been giving talks called "Preparing for Succession Planning," where he says, actually, we're building our mind children. These AIs are going to be made in our image, but they're going to be better than us in every respect. And so we should just bow out gracefully and prepare a succession plan. Like I haven't tried polling that with a nationally representative sample of Americans, but I don't think most Americans, most anybody would like sign on to that. That's a very like esoteric perspective.
Yeah, I for one welcome our AI successors. Okay. So you say AI wave is inevitable and superintelligence isn't. Talk about what you count as an AI wave versus superintelligence. Let's talk about that.
So there's a fear that regulation or any kind of intervention in for AI safety could stymie all the benefits, or we'd lose the upside out of excessive fear over the downsides, and lose out on like better healthcare, better drug discovery, the robot slaves that you're looking forward to. And what I'm just saying here is like we can have all those things and still not build superintelligence. Like the goal of building a unified superintelligence, which many people think is not possible, I think it is possible, but it's fundamentally an ideological mission. It's people who read sci-fi, maybe they read actually the original Less Wrong sequences and were like, let's make this happen, right? And they're intentionally going out to build a system that is vastly smarter than any human, potentially as smart as all the humans combined, in one coherent system with goals and motivations. You can not do that and still have AlphaFold 4, right? You can do that and still have general purpose robotics. So all the potential upsides that matter, at least in our current sense of what's possible, are achievable without building superintelligence. Maybe superintelligence is required if you want to build a Dyson sphere and climb the Kardashev scale and make us a type 2 civilization. But that's a very different angle, right? And I'm not even saying that we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying institutionally, politically, we are not prepared for that yet.
Okay, I also think it's very interesting you talked about Sam Altman and Sam Bankman-Fried are more the same than different. They're kind of like psychopathic Machiavellian manipulators. Is that what you mean?
Yes, and so the bigger thing, and I linked to this conversations with Tyler that Sam Bankman-Fried did, Tyler Cowen, where Tyler asks him, he says, you're risk neutral. You're a true Benthamite, right? So a risk neutral Benthamite should be willing to flip a coin, and if heads, the world is destroyed. Tails, we double the world and double the utility on the world. And he said, he adds some provisos, but basically agrees, yes, he would flip that coin, right? So if you're truly risk neutral,
that's weird.
It's very weird, right? But that's what a utilitarian should say if they're truly risk neutral. He's sort of biting that bullet, and that willingness to take very large risks for some speculative like doubling of utility or something like that. I think Sam Altman also shares that basic instinct that he has the ability, and that's partly why he's been successful in tech, the ability to kind of avoid sunk costs, suppress, it's called passive avoidance in psychology, like avoiding negative outcomes, not even thinking about it and just driving forward, because even if there's a 10% risk of destroying humanity, like the world on the other end could be so much better.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's sort of, I've heard Altman is just privately, or in my network of people that worked in tech in Silicon Valley that he is a very manipulative individual. So
I've heard the same thing.
yeah, it's not a coincidence that he is where he is. Okay, you have some stuff that's a little disconcerting. Technological transitions called regime changes. Now, just context, we talked about the printing press, which was the floor of your analogy. The printing press arguably triggered the Reformation, peasants' revolt. A lot of people died in Central Europe. It did end the kind of Habsburg attempt to create the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg domains, as more coherent rather than kind of a motley mishmash. So yeah, I mean, technology has transformed the world in a lot of ways, and if you think of the Codex as a technology, the Bible was one of the first widely distributed codexes in the ancient world. So we can go with like a lot of examples, but what do you think? Let's talk about regime change. Let's talk about regime change in the next decade. We're talking about 10-year scale for a lot of these things. I think that you're talking about.
Yeah, and so this draws on. I have another series of essays called AI and Leviathan, where I talk about specifically the regime change kind of dynamics. And yeah, you're right. The printing press induced wars of religion, number one, but like also a transformation of governance, of how governments are structured. The Westphalian nation state kind of emerged out of that at the end of the day. And you even see it with industrialization. So there's some good papers showing that like when the telegraph or rail networks were first expanded, that this led to an expansion in the federal administrative state, because that allowed the federal government to have state agents that could be in other parts of the country and have communication with them. And so people tend to neglect these sort of second order effects of technology and how they impact institutions. You sort of saw that with the internet, right? Whereas if we were having internet safety discussions in the year 2000, people would have been talking about like identity theft or cyberbullying and cybercrime. They wouldn't have foreseen that the internet would cause the Arab Spring, at first approximation, cause a crisis of legitimacy across the West and the rise of populism. And we had our own peasant revolt in the form of January 6th. And so where, the internet being a mere information technology, the internet plus social media and mobile, was enough to cause actual literal regime change in Tunisia or Cairo. In the West, it's just caused our institutions to buckle. And, I think it's very plausible that if you imagine the information tsunami as this like big wave, suddenly every particle in that wave now has agency and ability to reason. We may be at some sort of watermark where further disruption makes the lack of fit between our institutions and the base technological reality too much to bear. Okay.
Yeah, we'll see. We live in interesting times. That's your.
You see this in micro, right? So like Uber and Lyft were a regime change in how we govern taxis, like literal public commissions, utility style commissions were how we did ride hailing. 5 years go by and it completely flips. Taxi drivers are throwing rocks off bridges in France and killing themselves in New York. It was very traumatic for the people who were affected, but ultimately it led to a better way of ride hailing. Like it's just objectively better. But what it is a scaled private platform that has the ability to sort of implement AI and machine learning techniques and, routing algorithms and dispute resolution systems and all these new sort of social technologies for doing the regulation that the commissions used to do.
Yeah. It's like it's self-regulated. The system self-regulates itself, by rating people and whatever and all these other things. I do have to say, I periodically take a cab when I come from the airport just to see, and I do it once a year because it's they're like the whole demeanor, everything. Like they just, I don't know, man. I mean, it's fake. Uber's fake, great. But at least like they're not going to be like total dicks because they don't want a bad rating. I don't know. Okay. We've been going for a while, so I want to skip over like the institutional stuff because I don't know that much about it. But so in terms of like the last couple of things are interesting to me. Just dismissing AGI risks as sci-fi as a failure of imagination. Okay, so I think I don't know how to say this. But I feel like there's a large part of the policy elite, public intellectual class. Let me just define them as the type of people who are very involved with reading fiction in the New Yorker, who for them science fiction is just stupid, boring, uninteresting, and go away.
Right. Unless it's Ted
And
Chiang, then it's great.
yeah, whatever. But I'm just trying to say, like, there are people out there for whom like sci-fi is, low class. It's kind of like, middle brow at best, and so I do feel like they have a really difficult time at grappling with some of the science fiction-y extrapolations, these things you're just talking about, the AI that's here, and I think it's just like a cultural impasse that we're at, where there are people that don't want to admit that they live in a cyberpunk future, that's the present.
Right. Exactly.
But they don't want to admit it. And I think that's one of the reasons why more people are not focused on these topics.
Yeah, there's some kind of stigma attached, right? And like calling something the Terminator scenario is like pejorative, when having like a robot dog that chases you down and kills you is actually not at all inconceivable. But that's one of the reasons why I try to bring it down to earth a little bit with these like regime change discussions, where like AI killing everyone is one thing, but before we get to that point, like we're going to have like enough societal disruption that that in itself should be concerning. And one of my frameworks here is James C. Scott. It is Seeing Like a State. He also has this book, The Art of Not Being Governed, right, about the Zomia Highlands, and tell a similar story about like Afghanistan or Appalachia, these sort of hilly, mountainous, forested places where it's hard to build a state because people can just run away into the hills and avoid your governance. And the core like variable here is like legibility. How legible is society? And if you imagine a world maybe in 5-10 years where we all have 100,000 AI agents beneath us in some kind of individual corporation going off doing all kinds of productive things, like the world just becomes illegible. The same technology that is letting us solve protein folding and see new galaxies and galaxy surveys in aggregate makes it so the IRS can't collect taxes, right? Because there's like, what the hell is going on? And it's possible to adapt to that, right? You could imagine new institutions arising, right? You could imagine a new FDA that is able to process hundreds of new drugs every year and skip the clinical trial because you could just do it in silico. But that's not going to happen on its own or through incremental evolution. That's going to require like new institutions to form and displace the old.
Yeah. So you're talking about. So I kind of skipped over the part. I think we're talking about like institutions and institutional regimes, like very, very concrete things, and then you're also jumping to civilizational scale questions, right? And I'm just wondering, I kind of have an American-centric perspective here. Do you have any sense of like how it's viewed in Asia or elsewhere? Like, I think China is the main place that they're trying to do similar things, right?
Yeah, it's unclear. There is a Beijing Institute for General Intelligence that arguably is doing AGI-like stuff. China has put out models that are, at least competitive with U.S. models. The actual discourse is much more opaque. Like, what does the average netizen think about AGI? Is not at all clear. I would tend to think that being materialists in theory, that they should be open to these technologies being possible, but at the same time, the overwhelming prerogative of the Chinese Communist Party is sort of the maintenance of their civilization, the stability of their civilization. And that's very early on that these draft regulations that said, you may not use AI to do anything that undermines core socialist values or brings division to the state, right? And I also tend to think that the way China reacted to the Arab Spring, colors how they think about AI as well. So, we talked about how social media and mass mobilizations led to actual state collapse in some cases. China was watching that, and a big part of their firewall and surveillance state was built in response to that, and understanding how they're vulnerable to those sort of internal discords and sources of instability as well. So they sort of prepared themselves, sort of like a cockroach, or the cocoon, the cocoon their society to be, I think, more stable throughout this transition, right? And so, like, if you put a gun to my head and said, it's 2100, I guess basically 75 years from now, will the U.S. government still exist, or will the Republic of China still exist? And I would have very little. I'd put like less than 20% chance that the U.S. as a coherent institutional form still exists, but I think China will still be around.
Okay. I don't know why I think it's so funny, but
That's, by the way, not an endorsement. That's not an endorsement, right? That's not.
Yeah.
No, maybe the thing that replaces the U.S. is actually way better, but
yeah. Okay, so the last section 10, you have an assertion biology is an information technology. I think that's obviously true. I'm a geneticist, so that makes sense to me. But why did you jump into biology all of a sudden at the end?
Well, I needed 7 more theses.
I got it. Okay, you keeping it real.
No, I wrote all these sort of at once, and then it was unreadable, so I had to categorize them.
Okay. Well, so the seventh one is interesting to me because it's a little ominous. You say we live in base reality, and in nature there is no such thing as plot armor.
Right.
So I mean that has that P doom smell to me.
I think it's just true, right? Like the president of Iran just flew into a mountain. His faith didn't save him. He didn't have any plot armor. You could walk out today and get struck by a bus, right? We could have a comet that isn't visible to our satellites hit us tomorrow. The world is, we're both atheists, we're both naturalists, and the world is fundamentally indifferent to us. There's no karma, there's no morality play that structures the course of events. Sure. Elon Musk thinks that we may be living in a simulation, and that's why like the most ironic or entertaining outcome is preferred. But I think he's just suffering from his own sort of main character syndrome in that case.
All right. So here's the thing, though. If I get hit by a bus, I do want the listeners to know. I don't know if I've told you guys this, but I do have a friend who I talk to usually once a day, and this friend is tasked to check on me. Actually, have people check on me. 2 people. If I'm silent for too long, probably they're going to check my Twitter and other things too. And then after that, there will be an announcement. So just so people know.
You're not suicidal, though.
I'm not suicidal, but I have. I think everyone should do this. You don't know. Everyone should have like backup plans. So I have like everything backed up, and an email will go out to about 100 people about what happened. And so just so you guys know, you're not going to be left. You're not going to be left in the dark. You'll know immediately. But in any case, that was like a dark way to end. But I did want to like just say that in case I do get hit by a bus, because I was like, it's not like a 0 chance like this could happen. I want to touch really quickly before we end. I didn't read all of Zv's response. V Moskowitz, he has a Substack. Don't worry about the vase. He's basically a commenter from what I can see mostly. Like I've known of him for over a decade, but like on AI, existential risk, these sorts of things. And like, what was his general response to what you said? Because he had a bunch of responses to your theses.
Yeah, Z tends to write really, really long posts, so that he couldn't, not take up the offer. He basically agreed with most of my substantive points. We had some minor disagreements around some of the more philosophical things. So, where I say that nonprofits are, nonprofits where the CEO doesn't take compensation, i.e., OpenAI, have weaker powered incentives against AGI risk than a typical publicly traded company. He tended to doubt that. He's more cynical about Meta and their intentions. But I've just spent a career working in nonprofits and know how non-existent their governance is, and how if you want to do anything nefarious, definitely do it in a nonprofit.
Okay, like I'm not endorsing that contention right there. I don't want people out here to, this is not news you can use, everybody. Don't do anything nefarious.
No, don't
So,
do anything nefarious. But like if OpenAI founded themselves as a nonprofit in part so they'd be bound by a charter that said that they were tasked to building AGI that benefits all of humanity. And, their goal isn't necessarily to build AGI. Their goal is to make sure AGI benefits humanity, right? And now their entire AI safety team has fallen apart and they're just chugging on, right? So like how, Sam Altman was fired for like a weekend. So how much actual control does that have? And beyond that, like it's commendable to say that your mission takes priority. They even say in their letter to investors that, you're not entitled to any return. We don't know what money will be in a post-AGI world. It's commendable. On the other hand, it's also the start of a Michael Crichton novel.
Yeah. I don't know as much about nonprofits as you, but I will say that everything that I've heard about a lot of nonprofits, like ones that are prominent, even is they tend to be much more chaotic and disorganized than private sector, like profit-oriented, revenue-oriented companies. So I think the need for revenue, the need to drive profit imposes a tightness and discipline. Whereas like the nonprofit, there are nonprofits that are going to go on forever because of Lauren Powell jobs. I could name some other rich white women too. They have like a long leash and they can do what they want to do as long as they don't flagrantly violate. They can't flagrantly violate what they're supposed to do. The ACLU did.
Yeah, exactly.
The ACLU is no longer defending civil liberties. It's the American Woke Union, the AWU. So it's nonprofit can just go opposite or totally random directions. I mean, Discovery Institute in Seattle is pretty famous for intelligent design sponsorship stuff, but really their origins, and they still do a lot of this, is transportation. It's transportation, policy stuff in Seattle. And actually, Chris Rufo came out of Discovery Institute. I think he's doing more urban stuff. So, nonprofits are weird. Thank you for touching base on a lot of these things. I think a lot of my listeners are curious about AI, but obviously they have jobs. They don't work in nonprofits, so they can't keep track of all of this stuff. What are you working on now? Like, what's your new thing, or the new things?
The latest thing, I had a piece in American Affairs called "The Scramble for AI Compute," discussing the geopolitics of compute. My day job, I'm working on like export controls and related issues. So, keeping China from getting access to the most advanced chips. What are the sort of capacities that need to be built to do that effectively? And then just engaging on like the full waterfront of AI policy issues. Though there are a number of them like copyright and stuff like that. That just I think if you're worried about copyright or protecting rights holders, like you're not seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, that's a different conversation, but I definitely agree with you. Google Books. I mean, there's an article about it. Maybe I'll link to it in the show notes. Google Books was going to do all this great stuff, and the whole copyright thing stopped them. And so it really got hamstrung. I guess it was a hamstrung is what I was going to say. But anyway, it was nice talking to you. I'm not sure what my P doom is after this conversation. Definitely, it clarified a few things in my head, so it was good talking to you. It's very interesting. I think I'm obviously not going to do AI every single episode, but I think that we are in the AI age, and I'm just going to have to check back with people, every couple of months at this rate, because this is where we are, and it is affecting a lot of, it's not totally transformed. So my conversation with Nick Casmides in February, who himself has a startup related to AI. And I know Nick from Austin, so I know pretty well socially as well. It hasn't totally transformed things like engineering development and other things like that. But, we're in the early days. We tend to overestimate technology early on and underestimate it in the medium to long term. So exactly. I think we're going to see it. Yeah.
Well, if you need a break, I'll be back and we can argue why Canada's as close to utopia as it gets.
You know what? I need to cut it off right here. before I get triggered. You're just trolling me now, bro. You're just trolling me.
100% believe that. God save the king.
Okay, listeners, I will talk to you guys next week.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite part.